All right, everybody, we're back again. Um, I can move this. Nice. Okay, we're going to continue our look at water and hydrology this week. Today, we're going to learn mostly about water supply, so where we get our water from, not just we here in London, Ontario, but in general, where water comes from, and different types of water, be it water that you drink or water that leaves your house from various sources, and water scarcity. So, what happens when water is not readily available, and what are the reasons for that? Okay, well, let's go. So, here are the things that you should get out of this by the time I'm finished up. First up, we're going to introduce the concept of something called the water footprint. So, you might have heard or even done certain other footprint calculations before. Carbon footprint is an indication of how much carbon dioxide on average that you're responsible for emitting in certain ways. You might have done an environmental footprint, which looks at it a little more, looks at your environmental impact a little more broadly. Water footprint is similar. It looks at the amount of fresh water that you consume through daily activities and gives you a score, basically. You should also be able to explain the concept of water scarcity, scarcity being a lack of water for various reasons in certain regions. And you should also be able to identify and describe factors that contribute to that water scarcity. And in particular, we'll focus on two things: physical and economic scarcity. Last one is you should be able to recognize global patterns in water availability. So we're going to look at some maps. I love maps. We're going to look at some maps that look at patterns in terms of availability of fresh water. And we'll see if we can recognize some of those trends and discuss what that means, not just for the use of that resource, but also for political ramifications and policy decisions in those areas. Okay, so let's talk about the water footprint first. So the water footprint measures how much fresh water is used by an individual, or you could do it for, an entire school. We could do it for Beale. We could do it for the city of London. We could do it for the entire country as an average. Um, Basically, it looks at direct use, so when you turn the tap on, but it also looks at indirect use through the services and the goods that are used by an individual. So that direct use or direct water, that's stuff that you would directly use because you're drinking it, or you're using it to cook, or using it to clean, water your garden, wash your car, that sort of stuff. So it's directly you turning on the tap and using that water for a purpose. Whereas indirect water, it looks at all the water that was needed or contributed to the goods and services that you use. So that includes, the water that was used to create the produce that you're eating. That includes the water that's being used to create the energy, either to heat your house or to fuel your car, or to fuel the factory that made the stuff that you're wearing, or your phone, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I should mention. Actually, I'm going to go back for 1 second here. It's also important to note that the situation that we have in Canada isn't necessarily the same situation in much of the rest of the world. So when you turn on your tap and pour yourself a glass of water, that water that you drink is the exact same water that goes into your toilet. And for a lot of the world where water is more scarce, that would seem absolutely unheard of. There's certainly no reason that your toilet consists of drinkable water, so we call that potable water. There's no reason that you should be flushing potable water down every time you flush the toilet, other than the fact that in Canada we have so much fresh water that we take it for granted. In a lot of other parts of the world, that's most certainly not the case. They would never dream of using, liters and liters of fresh drinking water every time you flush the toilet. We'll discuss this a little bit more later on when we talk about water scarcity, but just keep in mind that the situation that we have here is different than the situation that much of the rest of the world experiences. Okay, so when we talk about types of water, I'm not necessarily talking about, fresh water versus salt water versus water and ice, which you might talk about if you're talking about water in the environment. I'm talking about water that is used and then eventually what happens to that water after it's used. So, depending on what the purposes are of that water, we call it something a little bit different depending on its source, how it's used, and then how it's put back out into the environment. So, blue water, so called blue water, is fresh water like you would find in rivers and lakes and in groundwater aquifers. An aquifer is just a body of rock that contains a lot of water because rocks have pores in them and the water will collect into them. So that's the kind of stuff that, that's your drinking water, which in London, Ontario, we get from either Lake Huron or Lake Erie. Some other smaller municipalities are still on groundwater, so they have wells. But around the world, obviously, it's also sometimes sourced from rivers or smaller lakes as well. Green water. So that green water, I guess it hasn't rained in a day or two. I just looked outside. No standing water in my backyard, but that's water that. So when it rains and when it rains enough, uh, you get a buildup, a saturation of the soil. So that the pores that exist in the soil and eventually in the rock below, as you remember from last week, when it rains, it will infiltrate depending on, again, if you're in a city, we don't have quite as much porous material because we have more concrete and asphalt. But in a natural setting, you're going to get some of that water infiltrating into the soil. And depending on the morphology, meaning depending on the slope, the terrain, you could get some of that water after a little while just stored in the soil, or if it becomes fully saturated, staying on the surface of the soil. So you see sometimes fields that are inundated with water or depressions that are inundated with water after substantial rainfall. That's called green water. So it could contain some of, if it's on the farmer's field, like you see in the picture there, that could potentially contain some of the, if there were pesticides, if there were herbicides that were sprayed, or even just fertilizer, it could contain those things within it. Gray water. So, gray water is everything that either leaves your house or could be a business, excluding stuff that leaves from your toilet. So, this is water from the sinks in your house when you're washing your hands for, the 30 times a day that you're still washing your hands. It could be water from the shower or bathtub. Basically, all of those, the kitchen sink, all the places except for the raw sewage that leaves through your toilet, which is called black water. So that black water is indeed water that comes from households or businesses or industries that is raw sewage. So that is the stuff that comes from your toilet and enters into the sewage pipes, which eventually get to that sewage treatment facility. So they are sorted and filtered out, which we'll learn a little bit later on as to how that happens. I talked last week about those problems with combined sewers that we have in London and many older cities where you have water from households uh, mixing with water that comes from rain, right? So storm water is the water that comes from rain and enters into those sewers that you see outside, whereas obviously water that leaves your household enters sewers, and when they are combined sewers, both of those go to a sewage treatment plant, even though obviously water coming from your toilet needs a higher level of treatment than rainwater that just went directly off of the grass or even from the road into the sewage system, and requires some treatment, but not the same level of treatment as does sewage. It's also again, I'll note this again here. Um, you don't have different pipes coming from your house that are from different portions of that house. They all enter into one big pipe eventually, meaning there's no little pipe that says this is just water from kitchen sink. Send this to a certain spot in the city. This is just water from my bathtub. Send that to another spot in the city. This is water from the toilets. Yes, this has to go directly to the sewage treatment facility, right? It all enters one big pipe when it leaves your house, goes into the sewage system, and all gets treated equally. Whereas we know that's not equal, which again makes it somewhat even more baffling to a lot of people why we would use drinkable, potable water in our toilet. Okay, let's take a look here. So here's a world map, and you'll have to take a look at what this map is showing by looking at the legend here. So this is the water footprint, an average water footprint for the nations around the world. And I want you to take a look and look at the prompts or questions that I have in the box to the right. So if you can look and try to spot some trends, let's see what we can find. First off, let's look at Canada. So my cursor here is highlighting Canada. And if you look at, it's an orange color, which marks it at about over 2,000 to 2,500 cubic meters per year on average for a Canadian. Now, that number might not mean much, so we got to compare it relatively to other places around the world and see how it stacks up. So we're in more or less, a little bit less than the United States, but pretty much the same category or a very similar category to the United States. If you look at some of the regions, so you might compare this to economic figures. So, are poorer countries using less water? Well, let's take a look. So if we look at that region that we've looked at before, sub-Saharan Africa, where my cursor is kind of pointing around, it does indeed look, so that's one of the poorest areas, and it does look like they have a much smaller water footprint than we do in North America, in particular Canada and the United States, less so in Mexico. But you also see some countries that are very high in terms of their economic power. So we look at some of these European countries, and you'll see that they have much smaller footprints than Canada does, even though their economies are similar, comparable. Look at Northern Europe, look at Western Europe, and they're in that yellow category, much smaller footprints than Canada has. So it's not just the economy. It's not just economic status that drives this. It's also things like availability of fresh water. Canada has so much fresh water that we don't value it perhaps as much as some of these other places that even though they have, on average, some of them have higher GDP per capita than we do. So on average, more wealth than Canada does, but they don't have as much fresh water. So they value it much more and don't waste as much of it as we do here in Canada. Which brings us to water scarcity. So, water scarcity occurs when, for one reason or another, or usually a combination of factors, there is not enough clean, safe water available for the population. And, it could be because of economic reasons. So sometimes, which we'll talk about in just a second, sometimes there's actually enough water, but for some reasons, usually political, that water is distributed in a fashion that, the richer you are, the more likely you are to have access to it. The poorer you are, the less likely you are to have access to it. It's made worse by climate change um, as well. So areas that are already dry are getting drier. So let's look. Oh, sorry. First off, so according to the World Water Council, there is enough fresh water on the planet for everyone to have more than enough to drink, to grow their crops, etc. And that's even considering um, the fact that most of the fresh water that we have, fresh being not salt water, is actually locked away in ice. So even considering all that, there's still more than enough fresh water on the planet to actually support all 7.5 billion people, a little bit more maybe now, that are on planet Earth. So obviously that begs the question: why do we have water scarcity when there's more than enough fresh water to support everybody? And the answers are, well, there are many answers, and often a combination of factors. Clearly, that water is not distributed evenly around the planet. So there are areas like Canada that have plenty of fresh water. There are other areas that are, you know, dry, arid, grassland, desert, where clearly water is not as available. However, uh, if you look at those areas, I mean, people will not, in general, purposefully stay in areas where they don't have any water. So it's not just the fact that naturally there's not as much water there, because there aren't going to be as many people in spots where there isn't much water, because people by and large aren't that stupid to settle and decide to grow a population where they don't have any water. With some exceptions, not for the stupid people necessarily, but exceptions where we've drilled very deep and found water in places that you wouldn't think water would exist. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two types of scarcity: physical and economic. The first, physical water scarcity, means that there just isn't enough water to meet demand. And demand comes from various places. It comes from the domestic demand, which is households, things like that, for drinking, for running everything in your house that you need water for. Industry is a big one. So water is used very heavily in all sorts of industries. Um, Too numerous to name them all, but for example, the ones I gave you. So in Alberta, they use a lot of water to mine oil, in particular from the oil sands, because that oil is kind of bound to these particles of sand, and they have to be uh, kind of separated, blasted apart by superheated water. In the steel industry, obviously, steel is used in the manufacturing of all sorts of products in construction, a big industry that uses a lot of water as well. And agriculture, obviously, crops need water, so irrigation, the use of water um, to use on the fields instead of just relying on rain, that irrigation uses a lot of water as well. So for all those are the big sources of demand for water, and physical scarcity occurs when there is just not enough supply to meet that demand. Here's a case study. If you've never heard of the Aral Sea, so the Aral Sea is in Central Asia. It's part of what was the former Soviet Union. And what the Soviet Union was a somewhat loose collection of states that was governed centrally by Russia. And during the Cold War, so after World War II, obviously, when Russia and the United States, the Soviet Union and the United States emerged as the two superpowers leading out of World War II, we had a Cold War for decades, whereby it was Americans and the West propping up certain nations, the Soviets and the East propping up other nations, never actually going to war directly. But they were all trying to build up their economies and their militaries to be the sole superpower in the world. And as part of this effort, the Soviets needed to ramp up production, agricultural production, particularly in cotton. So they wanted domestic capacity. They wanted to be able to grow it on their own in large quantities. So what they did is they diverted major rivers that went to this this body of water called the Aral Sea, and they used the water that they diverted from the rivers to irrigate their crops. And if you look at the picture on the left, that's a picture of the Aral Sea in the 1980s. Look at it on the right. That's 5 or 6 years ago. It has shrunk um, unbelievably. And this has caused all sorts of problems. It's actually turned into an environmental disaster. The Aral Sea, so first off, the diverting of water from those rivers that should have flowed all the way to the sea, sure, it's caused them to shrink so that if you were a fish living there, you're not living there anymore. So that's a direct influence on the ecosystem. But it's also changed the salinity in the water. So imagine you used to have, oh, I don't know, 100 times as much water or 1,000 times as much water and a certain content of salt. And then you get rid of 90% of that water. Well, the concentration of salt increases dramatically. So whatever didn't die and disappear because the water disappeared, so whatever creatures were still there were not are not adapted to the high salinity, that increase in the concentration of salt in the water, which caused further die off. So a very what used to be a very biodiverse ecosystem is now um, drastically reduced in terms of the number of species that are able to survive. Again, firstly, because you got rid of the water that they live in. And then secondly, the small pieces of water that were left had such an increase in the salinity that most of the aquatic life was just not adapted to it. Secondly, all that, the white area that you see my cursor kind of squiggling around here, that is a lot of salt that's left on the land. And what happens is that salt on the surface is now susceptible to big dust storms. They actually call them salt storms. So the wind will pick up and it will blow that salty uh, dust for tens of kilometers. And it actually is causing a huge increase in the salinity of the soil itself. On those same areas, the crop areas where they're trying to grow cotton, now they've got a problem that the soil itself gets salty um, because of all of that uh, residual salt that's left over that now blows all over the landscape. So it's really caused an absolute disaster in terms of the ecosystem, not just where the lake used to be, where the Aral Sea used to be, but also in the surrounding landscape. If you want to read a little bit more, you're welcome to. There's a link down there you can click on that gives you some more information about the Aral Sea and the sequence of events that have occurred. Economic scarcity is a little bit different. The two kind of go hand in hand sometimes, but not always. So there are many cases where there is enough water available. It's that there isn't the infrastructure to get that water. And if there is, it's not evenly distributed. So it will be priced in a way such that if you have the money, you're able to get it. If you don't, well, you don't. Um, and that infrastructure could be limited in terms of technology to drill deeper wells. Um, there's also some technology we can even now on not on mass scale so far because it's really expensive, but um, there are desalination plants where you can actually use salt water. So you could use seawater, remove the salt from it, and turn it into drinkable water. But that requires a lot of money. So in places where water is already physically scarce, a little bit in terms of there aren't giant Great Lakes like we have right next to us. Uh, if you don't have the investment in technology to get that water from groundwater sources by drilling or other means, then you've got a problem, and it's now a scarce resource, so it becomes priced in a manner such that if you are poor, it is harder to come by. Here's another map. So this map shows both physical and economic water scarcity. You have to take a look at the legend here. And the orange areas are areas where we have physical scarcity. The red areas here are areas where we have economic scarcity. And sometimes the two, as I say, kind of go hand in hand. So I'm just going to move this out of the way a little bit here. Ooh, maybe over here. So economic scarcity, you can see that same sub-Saharan African region that we talked about before. it is highly susceptible to economic water scarcity. So sub-Saharan means below the Sahara, right? So the Sahara Desert is right along here. And obviously, there are some cases where we have physical scarcity, but it's that economic scarcity that's a problem. If you have money, you have access to water. If you don't, you're in trouble. We don't see any of that here in Canada, with the exception, of course, um, of Aboriginal lands. So you have heard of places where on reserve there are boil water advisories and things of that nature that are always present. It's not, you know, a one-off situation where there was a contaminant and we better boil water. There are conditions in Canada that are, again, mostly on reserve, that are disgraceful for a country as rich as we are to have those problems exist in an already marginalized population. But for the most part, we don't see in Canada the physical or the economic scarcity that you see in other regions of the world. Well, I guess we can't really brainstorm in partners here. You could do this on your own. Uh, think about ways that we could. So mitigate means to reduce. So how can we help reduce physical and economic scarcity? Physical is a little bit more difficult because you can't just create water. Um, but by reducing the overall demand, right, using less water, you ease you ease the um, you ease the pressure, I guess, on the water supply. Whereas with economic scarcity, again, this is often a political problem that goes hand in hand. You need interventions to make sure that access to water is more equitable, and that's often a political issue that's harder to solve from afar. Right, United Nations. So they're always doing many studies, but they also have departments that are responsible for trying to bring some equity to the distribution of water and many other things. I'll let you read the stats there. Um, the take home being that there are a lot of people on this planet that do not have reliable access to clean water. Okay, so here's what I'd like you to do now. First off, I've got a footprint calculator here that you can click on, and it'll ask you a series of questions. I think some of the questions, if I recall correctly, it might be an American-based calculator. So if they ask one of the questions about where you live and they don't give Canada as an option, just pick a bordering state that has a similar, pick Ohio or Michigan or even New York, a place that has lots of access to clean water, similar to what we have. I then want you to click on this part right here. It just sends you to a spreadsheet, and I want you to put your number down. So what was the number that you got for your water footprint? You don't have to put a name to it. So I just have a number, students 1 through to 27 or something like that. So just go in order. Um, if you look on and you're the fourth person to do it, next to number 4, put your number in, and then we'll calculate an average to see how we stack up versus other places around the world. Lastly, what I'd like you to do is think a little bit about water scarcity. So again, this is not, for most of us, the situation we face here in London, Ontario, Canada, but it is faced in many, many, many places around the world. So I want you to think about both economic and physical water scarcity, and which of those two is the more difficult problem to solve? Either the fact that there, isn't as much water available to meet demand, so the supply does not meet demand for any number of possible reasons, or supply might meet demand, but because of poverty and the inequitable distribution of that water, pricing of the water, making it harder for people in poor conditions to access that water, it's just not distributed evenly. So which of those two is harder to solve and why, or what are some potential ways we can address either of those two situations? So I'm going to put that question on a doc in the classroom, and you can submit that answer to me, and we can discuss it next time we meet virtually. Okay, I hope everyone's having a great day, and you'll see my face again soon enough. All right, thanks.